yield such time as he may consume to Mr. Bill Browder.
Co-Chairman Smith, thank you very much for inviting me here to this hearing. I'm here today to present the story of the Bitkov family to the Helsinki Commission. As you know, Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer when he was murdered by the Russian government for uncovering corruption. I started a campaign for justice, which led to this commission spearheading the Magnitsky Act in 2012 and the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016. I also wrote a book about the Magnitsky story entitled Red Notice. Following the publication of the book, many people got in touch with me from around the world to share their stories. And one of those people was a woman named Irina Bitkov. Irina Bitkov shared a horrific story of how she was persecuted in the same way as Sergei Magnitsky. And she and her family fled their persecutors from Russia and ended up in Guatemala to terrible results, which I will explain in greater detail. I'm here today to share the Bitkov story because they can't be here today to do it themselves. They're currently in Guatemalan prison, where Igor Bitkov, the father, is serving a 19-year prison sentence. Irina and her daughter Anastasia are serving 14-year prison sentences for passport violations. I'd like to point out that I have no business relationship with the Bitkovs. I'm receiving no compensation for my advocacy here today. I'm here today because of the terrible, unconscionable injustice that they've been subject to, and I want to do something about it. The Bitkov story starts in the 1990s when Igor and Irina Bitkov became the owners of a successful pulp and paper business called the Northwest Timber Company. Over the 1990s, they built their business and it reached $80 million in profits, and it was valued at roughly $400 million. In the course of their business, the Bitkov family, through their company, obtained loans from Sberbank, VTB, and Gazprom, all state-owned banks, to upgrade their facilities. After the loans were given, one of the bankers approached the Bitkovs and asked them to sell 51% of their business for $25 million. Obviously, since their business was worth many multiples of that, they refused. Following this unwanted takeover request or attempt, a terrible trauma befell the Bitkov family. At the time, their then daughter Anastasia was 16 years old. She was kidnapped in St. Petersburg. The kidnappers demanded a ransom which took the family 3 days to accumulate. They paid the kidnappers the ransom. Anastasia was released, but when she was safely back home, the family discovered that she had been drugged and repeatedly raped by her kidnappers. The ordeal left Anastasia deeply traumatized and set off a cascade of psychiatric ailments which require medication and treatment to this day. Following that, and in a further escalation of the attempts to take over their company, the Russian state bank simultaneously called in their $158 million of loans, forcing the company into bankruptcy. During the bankruptcy proceedings, the equipment of their facilities was sold at a fraction of its true value. The Bitkovs were then told that they would be imminently arrested. This was the moment that the Bitkov family decided to flee Russia. First, they traveled to Latvia, then they traveled to Turkey, and in Turkey, they looked around the world to seek a country where they could find refuge and start a new life safely from the persecution of the Russians. They ended up choosing Guatemala because Guatemala had no extradition treaty with Russia, and they felt that they could be safe in Guatemala. They found an advertisement on the internet from a Latin American law firm called Coutinho Associates that specializes in immigration law and advertises expertise in organizing Guatemalan immigration for $50,000 per person. The family engaged Coutinho and began the process of becoming immigrants to Guatemala. In their initial communications with Coutinho, they explained that the reason for their immigration was to avoid persecution in Russia. Coutinho explained to them that they could change their names in their immigration applications to avoid detection by the Russians. Coutinho then had submitted for the family and the Guatemalan Migration Services, they submitted for the family papers, and the Guatemalan Immigration Services issued them new documents in new names. Anastasia kept her original name, hoping that because she was not targeted by the Russian authorities, that she would be okay. The family then began a new life in Guatemala. Igor became a high school math teacher at the Brillo de Sol school in Antigua. Irina became a drawing teacher at the same school, and Anastasia began a career in fashion after regaining some of her confidence after her horrible ordeal in Russia. In January 2012, Irina Bitkov gave birth to a baby boy named Vladimir. It appeared that their terrible ordeal with the Russian authorities had come to an end, and they could put that chapter behind them. Unfortunately, their dream of a new life came crashing down in late 2003. Investigators working for VTB Bank tracked down the Bitkovs in Guatemala. The head of VTB Bank, Andrei Kostin, personally signed a power of attorney to Henry Comte, one of the country's most prestigious attorneys in Guatemala, and an alternative judge on the Guatemalan Supreme Court to assist VTB in pursuing the Bitkovs in Guatemala. VTB Bank and Comte first attempt was to go after the Bitkovs in filing a criminal complaint with the Attorney General's Office of Guatemala, claiming that VTB had been defrauded by the Bitkovs in Russia. VTB presented photocopies of forged documents in the Guatemalan court. Those documents already had been rejected as forgeries in similar proceedings in Russian courts. When the Guatemalan court requested originals, VTB withdrew their criminal complaint. VTB and Henry Comte then came up with a plan B to go after the Bitkovs. For several years before 2013, in Guatemala, there had been an ongoing investigation into human trafficking and Guatemalan's officials' complicity with human traffickers in the country. It was called the migration case, and it was supported by a UN organization called CICIG, whose mandate was to go after organized crime networks who previously enjoyed impunity in Guatemala. VTB and Comte successfully convinced CICIG to focus on the Bitkovs as part of the migration case, in spite of the fact that the Bitkovs were clearly not part of any organized network of traffickers. Inexplicably, VTB gained the legal status as an interested party in the migration case against the Bitkovs with the support of CICIG. In January 2015, a criminal case against the Bitkovs was opened at the direction of CICIG. Immediately after, 70 armed police officers raided the Bitkovs' home, arrested Irina, Igor, and Anastasia, detained them in a cage behind the parking garage of the main court building in Guatemala. While they were being held, Anastasia was deprived of her antidepressant medications, and she has a severe psychiatric breakdown. Anastasia and her mother were moved to a hospital under armed guard, and Igor was put in pretrial detention at the Mariscal Zavada prison while the case awaited trial. The Bitkovs arranged for their family lawyer, who's sitting with us today, Ronaldo Alvarado, to be the guardian for their 3-year-old child, Vladimir, while they were incarcerated. In spite of Mr. Alvarado's valid guardianship papers, the prosecutor of Guatemala filed a motion with the court calling for Vladimir Bitkov to be placed in a state orphanage instead. At this point, the Russian government also got involved. Pavel Astakov, the Russian government's ombudsman for children's rights, publicly called for Vladimir Bitkov to be returned to Russia to be put in a Russian orphanage. The Russian foray failed because Vladimir is only a Guatemalan citizen and could not be returned to Russia. However, the Guatemalan prosecutor's motion succeeded and Vladimir was placed in a state orphanage. The family desperately applied to reverse the decision and get Vladimir out of the orphanage. It took 42 days for that application to be heard. When Vladimir finally emerged, he was examined by medical experts who found he had an upper respiratory infection, severe inflammation of the middle ear, conjunctivitis in both eyes, scars along the left eyebrow, and chipped front teeth, they concluded that he suffered from physical and psychological abuses in the orphanage. In the meantime, the case against the Bitkovs for passport violations moved through the courts. They were formally indicted as part of the CSEG migration case in April 2015. The Bitkov family appealed the indictment in the appeals court, arguing they were migrants and could not be subject to criminal prosecution applicable to the traffickers. In December 2017, the Guatemalan appeals court ruled in favor of the Bitkovs, declaring that any passport irregularities were administrative offenses punishable by a fine, and as migrants, they should not be under criminal penalty. However, CSIG and VTB were not happy with this decision, and both immediately filed appeals against the court decision that would have freed the Bitkovs. While their appeal was pending, the decision was not in force. A few days later, on January 5, 2018, the Guatemalan District Court found Igor, Irina, and Anastasia Bitkov guilty as users of the criminal network in a migration case. The court sentenced Igor to 19 years in prison and Irina and Anastasia to 14 years. CSEG trumpeted their court victory on their website, pointing out that they prosecuted 39 people from the criminal network, including the Bitkovs. I understand that the 19-year prison sentence that Igor Bitkov was given was greater than sentences for manslaughter, rape, burglary, and fraud in Guatemala. The sentences that all three of them were given appears to exceed the sentences of many of the government officials in Guatemala and traffickers who were part of the human trafficking network. There was no evidence that the Bitkovs bribed any government official or were involved in any corruption. The Bitkovs, who did not speak Spanish and did not know anyone in Guatemala on arrival, relied on the law firm Coutinho Associates, who presented themselves as legitimate migration lawyers. It also appears that nobody from Coutinho Associates who organized their passports and settlement documents has ever been prosecuted. No other customers of Coutinho have been tried, convicted, and sentenced like the Bitkovs. In the list presented by CSEG, which includes 39 people in the migration case, 36 were low and middle-level government officials from different Guatemalan government bodies, and a few coyotes who physically moved people through Guatemala. So what is going on here? There are two big Russian themes in this case, neither of which is unusual. First, in Russia, people who run successful businesses are routinely victimized through a process called reyderstvo. I was a victim of reyderstvo, and so were the Bitkovs. It is a standard practice in Russia where organized criminals work with corrupt officials to extract property and money from their victims. There are literally hundreds of thousands of businessmen in Russia who are victims of this as well. The second theme is the abuse of international institutions. The Russian government routinely abuses international institutions in order to persecute its enemies who are not inside of Russia. In my case, the Russian government tried 6 times to have Interpol arrest me after the Magnitsky Act was passed. The Russian government also successfully recruited a senior official inside the Swiss Federal Police to stymie a Swiss criminal investigation into money laundering by Russian officials in the Magnitsky case. The Russian government has succeeded in getting the Deputy Attorney General of Cyprus in charge of mutual legal assistance and extradition affecting the Magnitsky case and many other politically sensitive cases to inappropriately assist the Russian government in pursuing their enemies in Cyprus. This is not uncommon. In my opinion, the Russian government succeeded in compromising CSIG and the Guatemalan prosecutor for their own purposes in the Bitkov case. CSIG and the prosecutor's office have jointly taken up the Russian government's vendetta against the Bitkovs with no good explanation. CSIG did not distance itself from the Russian persecution. They touted it on their website, and they actively tried to overturn the Bitkovs' vindication by the appeals court. Nor has VTB tried to hide their role in this case. In spite of the fact that VTB obtained no financial recovery for their alleged financial dispute with the Bitkovs, they became an interested party in a case involving something that had nothing to do with them in order to vindictively punish Igor Bitkov and his entire family. In the Wall Street Journal on April 4th, 2018, Igor Kostin, the chairman of VTB, says, VTB's actions relating to the Bitkovs family is an example of standard procedure in resolving financial business disputes through available legal channels. This is an appalling case in which the Bitkov family deserves justice, and the United States has an opportunity to deliver them justice. CSIG is a UN organization in which approximately 50% of their budget comes from the US government. I do not believe that you or anyone in US Congress or the US government ever envisaged that US tax dollars would be spent to support a Russian government persecution of a family fleeing that persecution in Guatemala. I would recommend that CSIG's funding be suspended until this situation is resolved. When I began this process of advocating for the Bitkov family, I discovered that CSIG is a highly contentious issue in DC and around the world. There are some people who are pro-CSIG, and there are some who are anti-CSIG. Up until 2 months ago, I had never heard of CSIG. I came into this case with no prejudices, one way or another. I've gone where the evidence has led, and so far the evidence leads towards the conclusion about the involvement of this organization in the Bitkov's persecution. As journalists from the Wall Street Journal and other news organizations have started to investigate CSIG, CSIG has avoided answering a number of crucial direct questions about their role in the Bitkov case and their support of VTB. When CSIG was invited to give evidence to Congress, they declined, claiming as a UN institution they were not accountable to anybody in Congress. They can't have it both ways. They can either be the heroic anti-impunity organization that their mandate sets them out to be, or the situation at CSIG needs to be cleaned up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for your very incisive testimony and recommendations.